We're going to be looking at every GOAT and every weight class of the UFC. Now, there's been a lot of changes recently. A lot of people are making new lists. Some are saying Islam's the new lightweight GOAT. They're saying DDP might be over Izzy, and we just got to look into it. So let's look at the criteria. Number one, it's got to be domination. How much are you beating your opponents, and how great is the divide between you and your competition? If you can create a big divide between you and your competition, that's how you truly know your level's ahead. Number two is levels of competition. You can't just be beating straight tomato cans. I mean, you got to have some level of competition you go against, and people who are actually decent, people who go on to have good careers after you beat them, and people who are tested and proven in the sport of MMA. And number three, it's skill set and ability. How well rounded are you? And how well does your skill set work in the UFC? Guys like John Jones, obviously his skill set extremely well balanced, great striking, great grappling, great submissions, great defense. So we're looking for things like that. And then obviously you can look for volume as well. Like how many wins are you getting? You can't just be fighting once every 1 or 2 years. You got to be a little consistent and have a good amount of volume. For flyweight, top three flyweight goats. Number three, I got Figgy. He's got wins over Moreno, Perez, Joseph Benavidez twice, both brutal finishes. Pantoja, Tim Elliott. I mean, he's pretty much clear out his division. The only mark on his career at flyweight is the losses to Brandon Moreno. He's 2-1-1 with Moreno, so that damages his legacy a bit. But overall, he's been dominant. He's extremely well rounded, great grappling, nuclear power in his hands, and overall, he's just an amazing fighter. And that's why I had to give him 3 at flyweight. Number 2, it's got to be Pantoja. Now, look, obviously, Figgy has a win over him, but let's look at Pantoja. He beat Urseg. He beat Royval twice. He beat Moreno twice, one of which was on the Ultimate Fighter. He beat Asakura, Perez, Manel Cop, Matt Schnell, and Kai Kara France was also on Tough, I believe. He's completely cleared out his division. The UFC is to the point where they're bringing in other fighters. And like Figueiredo, he's extremely well rounded. I'd say his best attribute is probably his grappling. And then he's got pretty good striking. He doesn't have the best defense, but he can take shots really well with his chin. He's been extremely dominant. Pretty close fight with Moreno, I will say, but it was fight of the year. He just goes to war. He has amazing grit, amazing heart. I don't know how you put him anything lower than 2. And then at number 1, it's obviously DJ. I mean, probably the most technical fighter of all time. He has the grappling, he has the striking. Obviously, his power's not all there, but he's just an extremely well-rounded fighter. Has one of the highest fight IQs we've ever seen in the UFC, MMA in general. He went on a crazy tear, wins over Moraes, Cejudo, Elliott, Joseph Benavidez twice, Ian McCall, John Dotson, Ray Borg, Horiguchi. I mean, he has a stacked resume for his time. I want to say it's as strong as Pantoja's or Figueiredo's, but for his time and for what it was, certainly a strong resume. And then he has 11 title defenses, some crazy amount of title wins. But overall, he's just easily one of the GOATs. Beyond weight classes, he's one of the greatest of all time. And some people even call him the GOAT. So number 1 at flyweight, it's got to be DJ. For bantamweight, at number 3, I had to go with Aljo. Now, some people discredit him because some of his wins have like some asterisks on them, some marks. I mean, if you really look at his resume, you got Sandhagen, Dillashaw, Jan, Cejudo, Munoz, Hennenbrow. I mean, that's a list of killers right there. And then obviously his grappling is A1. His striking isn't the best, but he has some sleek tactics that can catch his opponents. It's definitely not great. I mean, he got knocked out by Sean O'Malley, but his grappling definitely makes up for it. And like I said, he has a great resume. He had what? Let's see, 3 consecutive bantamweight title defenses, which is one of the most of all time. Like I said, all against very good competition. Got caught by O'Malley, and obviously he's doing pretty good things at featherweight right now, but this is only bantamweight, so I can't count those wins. But at 3, I think you got to go with Aljo. At 2, it's got to be Cruz. He's got wins over Pedro Munoz, Uriah Faber, TJ Dillashaw, the big bad Scott Jorgensen. He's got a win over DJ, Joseph Benavidez, Takeya Mizugaki, Ian McCall, and then he beat Brian Bulls for the belt. Obviously, his resume is not as strong. I don't think the fighters are as high level as the fighters that Sterling has beaten, but they're still a great batch of fighters. Cruz had insane head movement, very good striking, very good wrestling, insane speed. Didn't have the most pop in his shots, but he was able to get away with it just because his head movement and his high volume striking. And then number one, I got Merab Dvalishvili. I know this is gonna upset some people. Oh, how can you have Merab over Dominic Cruz? Here's how. First of all, if they were to fight prime versus prime, let's call it what it is. Dominic Cruz would just get swallowed. Let's look further into it. Merab Dvalishvili is creating one of the greatest resumes of all time. He has Umar, Sugar, Cejudo, Yan, 50-45 Yan. No one's ever done that. Jose Aldo, Marlon Moraes, Cody Stamann, and Josh Dodson. He's on like a crazy fight win streak. Merab is extremely dominant. His striking's not the best, but his cardio is so out of this world that it doesn't even matter. He just swallows his opponents. I think you gotta have him number one. Yeah, you can't put Cruz at the top. Cruz lost to Cody Garbrandt. Cruz lost to Cheeto Vera while that was out of his prime, but still, I think Cruz is slightly overrated, just a notch. I don't think you can call him the bantamweight GOAT while looking at Merab Dvalishvili's resume. I just think it's a poor argument. So if you think differently, let me know in the comments, but I'd love to debate it because I truly think Merab Dvalishvili is the greatest bantamweight of all time. Featherweight at 3, I had to go with Ilia Topuria. He's got wins over Volkanovski and Max, two of the greatest wins, back-to-back knockouts. Josh Emmett, 50-44, 50-43. Bryce Mitchell, when he was still undefeated. Ryan Hall, who was a crazy prospect, and Yusuf Salah, which is aging like fine wine. Let's just call it what it is. Ilia has one of the greatest skill sets we've ever seen, and he is demolishing his opponents. He's got the Greco-Roman background in wrestling. He has nuclear power in his hands. His footwork's insane, and he always finds a shot to knock you out. Like I said, he has wins over some of the greatest featherweights of all time in Max Holloway and Volk back-to-back knockout. I don't know how you couldn't put him in your top 3. Who else would you put? Who else has that good of a resume and with that good of a skill set? The answer is no one. At number 2, we got Max Holloway. He has wins over TKZ, Arnold Allen, Yair Rodriguez, Calvin Kattar, one of the best performances ever, Frankie Edgar, Ortega twice, Aldo twice. Then he has Ortega, Pettis, Stevens, and Charles Oliveira. That resume alone is insane. One of the craziest resumes of all time. He has insane cardio, insane volume striking. We saw in the Ilya fight, he's still adding ripples to his game. He has great defensive wrestling, gets right up. Like I said, volume striking. One of the greatest chins of all time, which is why it's so crazy that Ilya could crack it. And like I said, he beat Aldo twice, but we'll come back to that. Number 1, we got Volk. He has 3 wins over Max Holloway. 2 of 3 were dominant. He has a win over TKZ, Brian Ortega, Chad Mendes, Darren Elkins, and Jose Aldo. Now, obviously, his grappling is insane. Good enough to compete with the best in the world. We saw it tested at lightweight, which I can't put too much stock in because this is featherweight, but we do know his defensive grappling is there, and it's insane. He has pretty good pop in his hands. He's insanely technical, insanely high fight IQ. He's very good at mixing it up. Look at what he did to Yair Rodriguez, cracked him on the feet, took him down, finished him there. And now I gotta address Aldo. Look, Aldo was good in the WEC. I'd have him at 4, but Max Holloway beat him twice. One of which when he was still in his prime years. Honestly, both of which. McGregor beat him in his prime, and Volk beat him in his probably a little on the decline, but still in his technical prime years. You can't look at all those losses and still call him the best. How are you gonna put him above the guys that have beat him, especially Max beating him twice? And the only reason I don't have Ilya above Max is because Max has the volume and the quality of opponents over time, which Ilya still needs to get a few more wins to get up there, but Jose Aldo's quality of opponents were not as good as Max's. That's why I don't have him above anyone on this list. He's just fighting in an older time. His competition wasn't as good. Like I said, we saw him lose to Holloway twice, Volk once, and McGregor in his prime. I don't think it's fair to put him at anywhere in the top 3. I'd put him 4, but certainly not top 3. Again, if you think otherwise, let me know, but I'd love to debate it. I truly don't believe Jose Aldo's in the featherweight top 3. All 3 of these guys I listed would, if not have already, beaten Jose Aldo. Don't try to tell me Aldo would beat Topuria. Topuria is like a better version of McGregor. Aldo would not have anything for him. Again, if you think otherwise, let me know. Lightweight, number 3, going with Oliveira. He's got wins over Jim Miller, Kevin Lee, Tony Ferguson, Jared Gordon, Michael Chandler twice, Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, and Benio Dariush. Oliveira has some of the best jiu-jitsu we've ever seen in the UFC, if not the best, with the most submission wins. He has insanely crafty striking. The one downside is he's very chinny, but look at his run. He is a champion. He beat Michael Chandler for the belt. He defended against Poirier, defended against Gaethje, and unfortunately he fell short to Makhachev, but then he bounced back, got a win over Dariush, had an insanely close fight with Arman Tsarukyan, which many argue he should have won. But I'm not here to debate that. I'm just going to look at the wins and losses, who the judges gave the win to, because that's just how it works. Like, if you get the win on paper, whether it was a robbery or not, you're going to get the number one contender spot or the next title fight. Or if it's for a championship belt, you're going to win the championship. Charles Oliveira didn't beat Arman, whether you think he did or not. Look, it's not under his name, so it was a loss, but still, he made it insanely close and showed great grappling, great submission ability. But I think overall, Charles Oliveira is the third best lightweight. Number 2, I had to go with Khabib. Obviously, his dominance plays a huge role, but his resume also does a little bit for him too. He's got to win over Gaethje, Dustin, Conor, Barboza, Michael Johnson, and a prime RDA. Now, he doesn't have too many wins. I can understand why people don't have him high on their GOAT list, but his domination was key. He's only lost a handful of rounds in the UFC. His striking wasn't too good, but due to the threat of the takedown, he was always able to have some degree of success on the feet. Look at the fight with McGregor or any of his other fights where his opponents were just backing up the whole time, using only a fraction of their striking arsenal in fear of getting taken down by Khabib. Now, obviously, like I said, he didn't fight enough, and his earlier career consisted of a lot of cans. But in his prime, he was one of the greatest lightweights of all time. He 100% would have beat Tony Ferguson. Let's just call it what it is. That's beyond the point for today. But anyways, Khabib at number 2. Number 1, I had to go with Islam Makhachev. He's got wins over Moicano, which actually is a great win, I believe, short notice. Poirier, Volk twice, Oliveira, Bobby Green, Dan Hooker, Thiago Moises, Drew Dober, and Arman Tsarukyan. He also went on like an 11-fight win streak. Pair that with the names he has on his resume. Personally, I think he deserves the number 1 spot at lightweight over Khabib for that. Plus, I think he has a more balanced game with better striking. The grappling is not as dominant, but I think he has a better submission ability, and overall, he's just beating better competition. So I got Islam for number 1 at lightweight. For welterweight, at number 3, I got Matt Hughes. He has wins over Renzo Gracie, Matt Serra, BJ Penn, GSP, Royce Gracie, Frank Trigg, 3 times over Carlos Newton, Sean Shirk. I think that's it. But mainly he uses wrestling. He has a few knockouts on the feet, which is probably aided due to the threat of the takedown. But he was one of the 2 men to hold a win over GSP. He had a crazy amount of fights, super high volume. Overall, he's pretty dominant in his fights. He was the champion at one point, and I think he slightly edges out Woodley just due to the fact that he has the high volume and he had the longer reign under his belt. At number 2, I got Kamaru Usman. He has wins over Leon Edwards, 2 wins over Colby, 2 wins over Masvidal, win over Burns, Woodley, Strickland, RDA, and Damian Maia. So not only does he have crazy volume, but he has wins over multiple champions like Strickland, RDA, Colby, Interim, Leon, and Woodley. At his peak, he was insanely dominant, mostly uses wrestling, but later on he got much better striking, and he had a pretty good jab. Obviously, he knocked out Jorge in their second fight, and then TKO'd Colby in their first, and dropped him twice in their second fight. The only thing that takes away from him is he got knocked out in the height of his career, and then he's been on a losing streak ever since and hasn't bounced back yet. I don't think he has any chances to be the number 1 welterweight anymore unless he somehow repairs his knees and goes on another crazy run. At number 1, I got GSP. He's got wins over Hendricks, arguably, Nick Diaz, Carlos Condit, Jake Shields, Josh Koscheck, Dan Hardy, Thiago Alves, BJ Penn twice. He avenged his win over Matt Hughes twice. Sean Shirk, Frank Trigg, Jason Miller, Matt Serra. He avenged that loss. But overall, he had a karate background, and he ended up getting really good at wrestling. He used that a lot in the peak of his career. And so he had good striking, good wrestling. Towards the end of his career, he didn't fight as much. He was pretty dominant. Obviously, a lot of decisions, which also took away from him. And then the 2 losses. But like I said, he avenged both of them, and he avenged the Matt Hughes loss twice. So I think number 1 at welterweight, you got to have GSP, arguably the greatest fighter of all time, if you only look at clean fighters. For middleweight, at 3, I got DDP. I think he just claimed the spot over someone like Whitaker just because of his win over Strickland recently. So now he has 2 wins over Sean, a win over Izzy, Rob, Darren Till, Derek Brunson, and Brad Tavares. It's a crazy lineup. Obviously, in the beginning of his career, he wasn't too dominant. Derek Brunson hurt him a lot in their fight, and then Darren Till also hurt him a lot. But each fight, he's been getting more dominant. He's also insanely well-rounded, good submission ability. He's able to outstrike Sean Strickland for 5 rounds. He has a crazy pressure never takes a step back, and his gas tank also is amazing. He can go 5 hard rounds. He doesn't gas out. So overall, at number 3, I got Dricus. I don't know who else you put over him other than the 2 guys I have better than Whitaker, just due to Whitaker's high volume of losses. Dricus has yet to lose in the UFC, and I think he'll also beat Hamzat pretty easily, as he'll definitely get out of the first round. And once they go from there, I think it's just going to be Dricus' fight. At number 2, I got Izzy. I don't know how much longer he's going to be 2 if Dricus keeps winning, but Izzy's got 2 wins over Rob, a win over Pereira, which is aging like crazy. Romero, Costa 2 times over Vittoria, Anderson Silva, Kelvin Gastelum in one of the greatest fights, Brad Tavares and Derek Brunson on the come up, and even earlier in his championship run, Izzy was crazy dominant. Obviously his wrestling wasn't the best, but he had good enough anti-wrestling to stay on the feet and use his striking to dismantle most of his opponents. His fight with Yoel wasn't the best, kind of like a stalemate the whole time, and then he did eventually have a problem finishing his opponents later on in his career, like Jared Cannonier or Marvin Vittori. But overall, his resume is insane. I'd say his best things are 2 wins over Rob, and even in his fight with Imavov, he won the first round pretty easily. Obviously, he got caught. I just think his chin's not there anymore, and at this point, he's probably washed. He's only 35, but he's been in a ton of wars, taking a lot of damage, especially in the Pereira fights, TKO'd by him. But overall, I think he has a pretty good claim to be number 2 at middleweight. And then number 1, I had to go with Anderson Silva. He has win over Brunson, Stephan Bonner, Chael Sonnen twice, Vitor Belfort, Damian Maia, Rich Franklin, Dan Henderson, and Nate Marquardt. And obviously, his resume is not as good as someone like Israel or Dricus, but he has a way higher volume. And at the peak of his career, also Forrest Griffin, if I didn't say that, but at the peak of his career, he was finishing almost all his fights. He had a submission game. Obviously, his striking was elite, and some even call him the greatest of all time. Crazy run. I think he is now tied with Islam for the longest win streak, and the only thing that hurts him is later on in his career, he stuck around too long, and he ended up getting a few losses on his resume. But overall, at the peak of his career, before he broke his leg, he was one of the greatest to ever do it, and I still think he's pretty high on the all-time GOAT list for all weight classes, but definitely number 1 at middleweight. At light heavyweight, for number 3, I got Alex Pereira. Now, obviously, he's not the most well-rounded, primarily a striker, but he has gotten much better with his defensive grappling. He has wins over Roundtree, Jamal Hill, 2 wins over Yuri, and a win over Jan Blachowicz. And this is just his light heavyweight wins. Obviously, he has the wins over Izzy as well, and then Strickland, but his striking is probably some of the best striking we've ever seen in the UFC. He has crazy power in his hands, some of the most entertaining fights. He usually finishes his opponents. We haven't seen him go 5 full rounds yet. He got to the 5th with Izzy, but finished him. But I just think at this point, it's almost like he's cleaned out his division. The only fighter left for him to beat is Ankalaev, which I think he will beat, because Ankalaev's wrestling isn't as good as people make it out to be. But overall, just his striking tool bag alone, insanely deep. Some of the best leg kicks, his left hook, his distance management, his fight IQ, as we saw in like round 4 of the Kluge fight. And then he fights very frequently. He was just the fight of the year last year. I think it should have been Topuria, but either way, that's still a high honor to receive. And I don't know who you'd put above him for number 3. Maybe like you could say Anthony Johnson or Rampage, but I think Alex Pereira beat both of them, and he has better names on his resume. At number 2, I got DC. He has wins over Anthony Johnson, Dan Henderson, Roy Nelson, Frank Mir, Josh Barnett, Anderson Silva, and Alexander Gustafsson. DC mostly uses wrestling, but was able to develop some pretty good clinch and dirty boxing. He ended up getting some pretty good power in his hands, and was even outstriking someone like John Jones at one point in their fight. And then obviously, like I said, his wrestling was elite. Probably some of the best wrestling we've ever seen. He came from a great college career. He's a crazy resume. Pretty dominant at his peak. Went on a good win streak, and the only man to beat him was number 1, who's John Jones. I think personally he's the greatest fighter of all time, but definitely the best light heavyweight. He's got wins over Santos, Anthony Smith, Gustafsson twice, DC twice, but technically he got suspended the second time, so that one didn't count, but he still KO'd DC. Rashad Evans, Rampage, Machida, Belfort, Ryan Bader, Chael Sonnen, OSP, Glover Teixeira, and Stephan Bonner. I think John has an underrated light heavyweight resume, honestly. A lot of people say he fought a lot of cans, but look at the names I just gave you. Most of them were champions at one point or interim, if not number 1 contenders or fought for a belt. And then obviously John Jones' striking was insane. Insane wrestling, high fight IQ, and he didn't have the most power in his hands, but he was able to get away with that due to his defense, and then he had an amazing chin as well. He's never been dropped in his UFC career. And he also has the win over Reyes, which some people think was a robbery. Honestly, I think everyone thinks it was a robbery. Not just a bad night for him, but overall, he's got the best light heavyweight resume by far. He was insanely dominant, never truly lost a fight. He's got the DQ to Matt Hamill, which was illegal elbows, but he was winning that whole fight. So I think he's the greatest of all time. Surely the greatest light heavyweight. For heavyweight, at number three, I got Cain Velasquez. He was known for his cardio mainly. He pushed a crazy high pace. He has wins over Travis Brown, JDS twice, Brock Lesnar, Nogueira, Chet Congo, and Ben Rothwell. It's not the craziest resume, but I think his skill set alone, paired with his cardio, made him one of the best heavyweights of all time. If he wasn't able to knock you out on the feet, he would have been able to take you down, and vice versa. He was just one of the very few well balanced fighters at the time. Overall, he didn't have too much volume in his career. He only has, I think it's less than 20 wins, so he didn't fight too much. But while I was around, pretty dominant, and he had one of the best skill sets we've ever seen at heavyweight. At number two, I got Fedor. He's got wins over Rampage, Chael Sonnen, Frank Mir, Andrei Arlovsky, Mark Hunt, Mark Coleman, Kevin Randleman, and Nogueira. Obviously, the big stain on his resume, his career, is that he never joined the UFC and fought the top talent, and a lot of his wins that I just named were over washed fighters that were just coming out of the UFC or before they went in. But similar to Velasquez, he had great wrestling and he also had amazing striking. He was very well rounded for his time and he was usually able to find holes in his opponent's game. Another thing that hurts his career is that he took on a ton of losses on the latter end of his career before he retired. It kind of destroyed his record a bit. So that's why I can't put him at number one, along with the fact that he fought mostly washed fighters and he was never in the UFC. But other than that, his skill set was definitely one of the best we've ever seen. And number one, I got Stipe. He's got 2 wins over DC, a win over Ngannou, a win over JDS, a win over Overeem, Fabricio Verdum, Andrei Arlovsky, Mark Hunt, and Roy Nelson. Everyone knows Stipe is the greatest heavyweight of all time. I'd say it's pretty consensus. He was primarily a wrestler, but he was also able to develop some pretty good boxing. Similar to DC, he had crazy knockout power, and he had the most title defenses of any heavyweight of all time in the UFC. He's fighting the peak talent. Obviously, he has the loss to Stefan Struve, and then he got KO'd by Ngannou, KO'd by Jones as well. By the time the Ngannou fight came around, you could argue that he was already washed or on the decline. And then Jones obviously beat a version of him that was coming off the couch off of a knockout for how many years? Like 3 or 4 years of inactivity. So I think those things can hurt his resume a bit. But overall, I think he's the greatest heavyweight we've ever seen. Not the highest volume of fights, but very high quality. Probably the best heavyweight skill set we've ever seen. That was my list for the top 3 GOATs in every weight class. If you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments. Make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already. That's all I got.